thought it was worth it just to hear Aaron speak my copy there. Yeah, so I started out, like most audio creators, working in full res audio, which is a ridiculous sentence that I ever even had to say that word. It would make no sense having to said that 20 years ago. But here we are in the 21st century, and I have been working in mobile audio almost exclusively for the past 5 years. Not by choice, I've just gotten into it, I've gotten good at it, and there's a lot of weird things happening. But I want to talk about how to optimize for that external speaker. There is an origin story for the title of this. Years ago, I got a gig, it was an ad gig, and they wanted me to do a track that sounded like Queen. Queen keeps coming up. And they were like, yeah, we wanted to have a bunch of dynamic sections, A, B, C, D, E, F, G sections. We want to have like 48 tracks of vocals and go nuts. And you know, you never get that for a commercial gig. So I was like, great. So I did the track. It was an ad. I was done. I turned it in. I got a phone call from the producer. And she said, this is great. We all love it. It's hilarious. It's done. There's not even any iterations we need to do. And on the other end of the phone, it was really loud. I could barely hear. And I said, well, where are you at? And she said, well, I'm at a bar right now. It's like, well, has the team heard it? She's like, yeah, we're all here. I played it for them from my phone. And my heart sank. This was like 2006, right? Because I did all that work. Now, mind you, they loved it. They approved it. The check cleared. But this was the first time in which I realized this is where things are going if they're going to review something that crazy just on an external mono phone. Around the same time, I started getting mobile gigs doing audio, and there was an article by Phil Spector, who's a very well-known producer from the early 60s that did the Ronettes and, you know, the Wall of Sound and Be My Baby and all that. And he was talking about how he knew that his final world was an AM transistor radio that had 20 millimeter speaker made out of Mylar that someone's listening to on a beach. And it was all these things that he was trying to figure out, tricks to go around that speaker to get people's attention. And what was sad is almost everything he said applied to my world right then and there, and still did. So that's where the title comes from. I'm going to go through a few areas of consideration. I'm going to talk about hardware. I'm going to talk about the mobile audio engine and memory. I'm going to talk about arrangements and mixing, which are the two biggest things you really need to know. And this is going to be a very iOS app-centric discussion, only to the extent that that's most of the work that I've done. I will do apps and games for iOS, for iPhones and iPads. I will see it's later ported for Android. No one's ever come back to me asking for anything. All the assets are created, so I assume it sounds good, but I mostly know iOS. And right off the bat, getting to what Greg said earlier, you might think, well, why are we even talking about this? Everybody has external speakers, so who really cares? Well, two areas in which you can make income, and in which I make income. Ringtones, ridiculous. Ringtones are still around, believe it or not. I just finished a year-long contract for a Windows Mobile that paid my mortgage every month. And actually, I sort of upped the idea of what ringtones were. They were more musical than just repetitive measures. But that's still dealing with an external speaker. That's never going to go away. Kids games. I do a lot of kids games. There's a lot of money in kids games. And for tablets, like I did this right here. It's a thing for Nickelodeon, Dora the Explorer. For a lot of these tablets, they sort of function as board games. And so they'll have 2 or more players, so you're still dealing with external speakers. Everyone needs to hear it. You have timers. So here's 2 instances where it's not, the earbuds do not come into play. So I still have to figure out how to make that external speaker work. Hardware, I'm going to start with this, but there's actually very little to tell you. If there's anything that will make you feel how little audio people are valued, try looking at the spec sheets of any mobile device. They will go on and on and on about the display and about the resolution and the video. And all you get about audio is, oh, here's the formats that it plays in. Sometimes you'll get a frequency range, and it's always 20 hertz to 20K. But the things you really want to know, which is what I always wanted to know when I started getting into this, okay, what are the resonant frequency for the case? Like, what's going to make it rattle? Or what's the material of your speaker? Or what's the size of it? Or what's the frequency response range of the external speaker? You can't find this information anywhere, unfortunately. Nobody's really giving it up. Nobody really cares. So I don't have a lot to tell you. This is old information, but I found this is to be true. There was a guy that did a frequency response range test on the external speaker of iPads and iPhones. This is for iPhone 3, iPhone 4, iPad 1. But I find that this range is my playground. It's still true to this day. pretty much from about 150 hertz to about, I'd say 8K is my world. And it is pretty flat in between there. I haven't found anything for the external speaker to really go out too much or go down too much. So that's kind of all I can tell you on hardware. Audio engine and memory, this is where it's a pretty big consideration. For iOS apps, last year with iOS 7, I think it's September it came out, they just raised the over-the-air app limit size to 100 megabytes. If you don't know what that means, over-the-air means you can download the app with cellular data. You don't need to have Wi-Fi. When the App Store came out, it was 20 megabytes. Then it went up to 50. Now it's at 100. The thought being that if it's anything bigger, people aren't going to have spontaneous purchasing. If you're not going to do it in your car if it's a half a gig or something like that. And there are apps that are half a gig, like Infinity Blade, I think is 800 megabytes. What this means for you as an audio creator, though, is that you're only going to get 30 to 40% of that for audio, and you got to fight for that, actually. And you might think, well, no big deal. I'll just compress all my files. Well, here's what you need to know about the audio engine. The iOS audio engine can only play one compressed audio file at a time. This is where things get interesting. So an uncompressed AIFF is about 10 megabytes for 1 minute of stereo audio at CD quality, right? So that means you're going to get 3 or 4 minutes of uncompressed audio if you do everything uncompressed. Again, you're having to fight for that. And if 3 or 4 minutes is enough for your game, great. Then nothing I'm saying here is really that interesting to you. But most of the time, that's not the case. Most of the time, you have to make more happen. So typically what I do, I keep the really important moments, which is usually the timers, which is usually music. Those I do as the mono PCMs, so those are uncompressed. And then everything else, my UIs, my sound effects, those are AACs. And I have, typically what I do is my export from Logic is 96 to 110 kilobytes per second with a variable bit rate. So that's how I separate those two. Now, to me, the real key things about this external speaker, let's talk about arranging. Your world is mono. That's it. Your world is mono. I kind of have no choice. And as I said earlier, I see a lot of play testing for these things, and the value of stereo is just, it's so low. Nobody really cares. The portability is what's great. The game is in front of them. That's all that matters. So things like stereo effects or delays going back and forth, you're not really playing with that anymore. Embrace space. I mean this in the sense of arranging for music mostly. If you think about the environment of where people are playing these games, and if they have an external speaker, they already have an environmental loop. It's wherever they're at. If they're on the bus, they already have an ambient loop of the bus. If they're in the park, they have an ambient loop of that. It's pretty rare that anybody playing mobile games has a console scenario where it's a room dedicated to that console with dedicated speakers where you only go there to play. That just doesn't happen. So the arrangements I found that are really successful are ones that have a lot of room between the different elements. It doesn't mean your music has to be minimal. You can have 3 instruments and do something really manic, but there just has to be space in between what really defines that piece. Have fun with psychoacoustic effects. This is one of the things that was from the Phil Spector piece, I remember. Tic-tac bass. I didn't even know about this. This is something he did. So apparently the speakers back then could not necessarily reproduce a bass line. They only did from like half up. And so he did a thing where he would have a baritone guitar, play the same line an octave up, and would just pick it staccato, kind of just giving it a top end. I don't understand how the science works, but apparently your ears puts that information together and perceives the bass line in full, even though it's actually not being reproduced. Don't know how it works. Do know I do this all the time, and it's amazing. And it doesn't mean that I do the baritone guitar. Anything where it's sort of picking up top, it doesn't even have to be perceived either. It can be mixed down pretty low where you're not even hearing it. If you really hear that top part with the baritone guitar, it sort of sounds like a George Jones tune or something. It sounds a little country-ish, but this one works. This is kind of fun. And there's other psychoacoustic effects that are out there too that are probably of value here. Avoid crash cymbals. Avoid white noise in general. I had a kid's game where it was a search thing where you had a bunch of cards that were on the iPad. You touched it, it turned over, it had a picture. They wanted audio to accompany all of those. And on the same board, they had a seashore and a thunderstorm and a skillet with bacon frying in it. It's like, wow, man, even at full res, like that's all the same thing. It's not going to come through. But musically, the same thing for cymbals. It's just not going to be perceived as well as other instrumentation. In general, the drier, the better. Reverb is just gone from my world. This is such a sad speech, isn't it? It's like a eulogy. Though I will say something interesting about this. I have found that, I'll get to that actually in a second, but things like reverbs, there's just not a lot of bang for the buck. They're not hearing it. And you don't have the space for tails to occur, right? We're all fighting for real estate and your file size, so they just go to the wayside. Mixing at the end, as we were talking earlier with Greg, monitor from the device from the beginning. I create on my laptop, I immediately put it all up in iTunes. I might put 3 or 4 different mixes, listen to them all together out of the devices. I make sure that all my producers are listening from that as well. There's no reason to not listen to it in the device. And as mentioned earlier, by the time you get to the end of the game dev cycle, you're almost mastered automatically, right? I monitor my mixes in the device with the volume at 75 to 80%. I want my audio to sound great when it's totally turned up. But the thing you have to your advantage is that everything sounds like crap, totally turned up, relatively on an iPad or an iPhone. So, you know, the bar is there, right? I also noticed that in playtesting that a lot of times this is how people set up their device anyway. For playtesting, we don't just playtest the game itself, but also how they set it up. We will actually give them devices and just say, oh, here's the name of the app, it's on there. So we want them to find it, go through the menu, set it up. And I found that everybody puts it in this area, so that's what I monitor too. Audit every track in your sequence to eliminate non-defining frequencies. This is interesting to me. This is a hi-hat. Here's an EQ analysis of a hi-hat hit on the first beat. When I think cymbals, I think 1K to 2.5K. Look at all this interesting stuff, though, that's from 1K down. Who knew, right? And if you go through each individual instrument and really judge, is that stuff from 1K down really making that hi-hat be a hi-hat? It's probably the hit of the drum, or the drumstick, I'm assuming. But I would roll that off, and I would probably roll even the overtones up top, and just, but you can play with it. You can just squeeze and see what just makes this a hi-hat and nothing else. Reasons for doing this are kind of obvious. You don't want that information from 1K down competing with something else. And let's say it's not competing with something else. Why put that energy through your audio engine to reproduce it if it's not really making the hi-hat the hi-hat? This is a very hip-hop philosophy. And I found that hip-hop approaches are great for these external speakers. And you might say, well, what era? I mean, from the 80s, I mean, there were some gated reverbs in the 80s, but every era of hip-hop is all about everything being extremely defined in its space, and then maybe the hook or the singers is the one that goes over that and flies and has full frequency and reverb. But hip-hop approaches work really great for external speakers. This is a minor point. I tread lightly on the fundamental frequency ranges of the human voice. Mostly because people are speaking in a room, so you don't want to have something that is really defined, some musical piece that's really defined in these areas. And voiceover, which occasionally happens. I don't think this is a hugely important thing, but I just try to be conscious of it. I should have put this at the beginning. This is my playground right here. I start off and I just roll off the bottom from 80 hertz down to 20, and I roll off the top from 80K to 20K, or 10K to 20K. I just don't want to be messing with anything that sounds great, and then that's not really what the speakers can produce. Normalize or not normalize. I don't normalize my music. I think I've just gotten deft enough of creating music that sounds good enough on its own that by the time you get to a mastering stage, there's no reason to do that. Sometimes I normalize sound effects, kind of what Jesse was showing earlier, if you really want them to stand out. Or let's say it's some bell type thing that has a bit of a tail. You kind of want that tail to be heard. I might normalize that so the tail comes up, but for the most part I don't. And just general limiting. I limit almost everything down to a negative 1 dB. There is an additional thing that I would not go into because this is like a 45-minute deal. It's actually one of the presentations I suggested. concatenation. I don't know if anybody knows about concatenation, but gets really interesting and also gets really heady. It's mostly about saving real estate in your audio engine. A quick way to explain this, concatenation is just taking discrete elements and stringing them together to be something bigger than discrete elements. I'm concatenating right now. I'm speaking words I've learned throughout my whole life. I'm putting together into sentences, right? Code is concatenation. How this applies to audio and apps for saving space. There's so much repetition in music, and you can take advantage of that. Let's do a really simple example. You might have music where the intro is 4 measures, but it's really just 1 measure repeated. Instead of just handing off that whole file to your dev guy, break up that 1 measure, tell him, repeat cell A 4 times, then go into the main body, right? Now you just saved yourself X amount of space to get more audio into the audio engine. That's a really simple example, and it can get very fluid and elegant, and you can make a very small set of discrete audio go really far. I have a tutorial that I have online for audio tuts that they publish that has logic files that you can download and play with, but this would be almost like an hour to talk about. Some of you will get excited, some of you, your head will hurt. So anyway, I have it on here. And you can download that and find out where it is. So that's it. For me, I feel like I am there's people that know a lot more about this than me. If you're in the room, feel free to stand up and say I'm out of order, say this presentation's out of order, this whole room's out of order, and grab my mic and take it over, because that would just be fun. Anyway, that's it. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, so in your mastering process, right? I mean, for the soundtracks, obviously at some point, someone might want to buy it on its own, right? And at that point, they would not be listening through phone speakers. So would you have the audio remixed and remastered for that?
That's a really good question. There has been a few cases where that has come back. There's a PopCap game I'm thinking of where that came back. And in that instance, if they then want to sell that, I then have a version that is me doing it as if it's PopTune in stereo full res, right? And that's an opportunity to sort of fill it out and feel a little bit better about what I went through. But it's not the same material. It's sort of like when I'll do ad work too. And at this point in time, most ad work just means YouTube. But every once in a while, it also means YouTube and a broadcast campaign, and I'll have 2 different mixes for that, right?
So, something along the same lines, in a game where you might have someone playing on headphones and someone playing with the speakers, do you take that into account and master it so that it falls somewhere in the middle, in the sense that, when you put in the headphones, you don't hear? Because, I mean, you would definitely hear cutting from 80 hertz.
Yeah, your baseline is gone. Tell me the situation again, though, where it would be headphones and the speaker.
You have a situation where, it's not like the Dora the Explorer game where you definitely will be using the speakers. The person would have a choice. Some of them would play with headphones, and some of them would play with the audio coming out of the speakers. In those cases, I mean, in cases where you are not sure how they'll be listening to it, do you try to master the audio for both situations?
I have not, only to the extent that situation's never really come up for me where the team has an understanding that could happen. Mainly because, again, kids' games. I mean, what you're talking about is a bit, which is not to say kids wouldn't do that, but it's a bit more sophisticated situation than playtesting really bears out. So unfortunately, I don't really have an answer for what you're saying.